Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of TEQ. Today, we're going to tackle the topic of emotional intelligence within a leadership context. If you have been following along since the beginning of the podcast and even before that in the articles that I've been writing around the future of work, you heard me talk about how empathy is the new superpower of leaders. And while we seem to have a lot of focus on upskilling and reskilling when it comes to technology, I haven't really seen enough focus on this topic, on looking at how leaders and managers who should be in touch with their own emotional intelligence, and in particular, be able to empathize with their talent, how we get this skill to become more predominant and something that, if it's not present, organizations are willing to put effort into preparing their leaders to be emotionally equipped. Today, I have the great pleasure of welcoming Stephen Rose, who is a GM of Global Telco Industries and Distribution at IBM, to this conversation. Stephen and I met a few months ago at a Women in Telco Summit organized by Fierce Wireless, and I was so struck by the passion and the insights that Stephen brought to the conversation, really around the inclusive leadership topic. And so I went and stalked him on LinkedIn, as you do. And I saw how he describes himself, which is a leader with a deep passion for the betterment of humans at the intersection of technology and change, which is amazing and so well needed today. So he is an advisor. He is a leader, obviously, and is a mentor. And I think that the combination of that, to me, makes for the perfect leader and manager. And I will urge you to join me in welcoming Stephen to the conversation. Hi.
Hi, Carolina. Lovely to be here.
Thank you for the time. And I know that the audience is going to appreciate me starting easy on you with a question about your personal experience and really tell us about your journey. How did you get to be as awesome leader and manager as you are in embracing your emotional intelligence?
Well, that's first off very kind. Probably too kind.
It is true.
But I think it's interesting. I think leadership, first off, is never perfected. I think it's one of those things that you just consistently have to work on, and you will never get to perfection. But you will maybe get better over time. In terms of my own personal journey, I think it goes right back to crucible experiences when you were younger. I think come from pretty humble background. I was born when my mother was 17 and my father was 18 years old. So, and we were born into very, very humble, sort of background in the UK. I think that in itself was an interesting start point to life. There's a lot of experiences that you end up going through that typically help you understand others and whatnot later on in life. I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is, my mother, can never forget that. She was just an incredible lady. She had a fierce determination for living out who she is and not really being one to worry about what the notion or the agenda was in the political spectrum, or perhaps she didn't really care too much about being told what to do in life. And I think she was very good at that.
I love your mom already.
Yeah, she was. And to be fair, if the system had told her what to do today, I'd have probably either been not here or adopted. Yeah, and she fiercely. So that's the kind of person that she was. And then on top of that, I think it's just working through life. I mean, I was very, very fortunate over the last 25 years or so to have worked in many, many different countries around the world, and then I've had 4 children in the meantime. And having children actually, also informs you of your notions around experience, right? One of my children had to navigate some pretty serious discussions when they were quite young about their own identity and their own sexuality. So I think that's a very interesting way of actually learning how to navigate those things. And then just, yeah, lots of exposure to different cultures, different expectations, different norms. So yeah, it's been an incredible journey, highly informative.
Yeah, you and I share that experience about our kids and finding their way and what we learn from them. And I think even that alone, does obviously make you grow as a human being, but requires a certain level of empathy to be willing not to think as a parent that you have all the answers and then you know best. And second of all, not to think that your experience is going to be their experience, right? And I think that's true about leadership as well, right? Just because we do things in a certain way doesn't mean that everybody who works with us is going to do things in the same exact way.
Yeah.
I said that you are a leader, a mentor, and a sponsor, among other things. And I'm curious as to how you can help people understand the importance of wearing kind of, if you like, these different hats as a leader.
Yeah, so I think there's a few things. I think different to mentor, ally, those types of things, they're very different types of roles. But I think actually maybe what's even worth understanding first is establishing what is EQ, because I think a lot of people see it as a nebulous thing. I think it's one of those things that people, a bit like culture, people say, well, what is culture? And then they describe it in 100 different ways. So when I think about EQ, I think about it in 4 different ways. I think it's self-awareness. Yeah, just understanding your own identity, your own personality. Personality comes into a large part of who you are, of course. Your biases, understanding and being self-aware. I think the second thing is self-management. Do you understand boundaries? Do you understand your boundaries, but you understand the boundaries of others? If you don't understand that, it's very difficult to engage. I think it's about social awareness. So I think about it in the context of how others feel, how changing attitudes happen over time, because the attitudes that we have here in 2023 certainly aren't the attitudes that were here in 1993 or 1973, right? So lots have changed. And I think it's last couple of things. I think it's about relationship management. Do you invest fanatically in the people that invest in you, or do you deal transactionally with the world? And I think it's also about likability. Are you transactional? And coupled to that, are you approachable or not? So I think, EQ is actually much more scientific than people would like to believe. It's highly measurable. And it's something you can really understand and work on detail. When it comes to the question of allyship and mentorship, I think allyship is huge. I think as a leader in today's society, you're expected to actually lead from the front in terms of understanding to what extent there are issues of representation inside of the business, and do you understand them and do you represent them? And it's a little bit like any discussion that is where you're moving minorities from one position to another, or whether you're leading situations where women have to move from one particular situation to another. That is, you need to over-rotate on that. That's allyship, if you ask me. I think you have to be vocal, you have to be very expressive, and you have to invest in it. That, for me, is very, very important. I think mentorship is the investment in individual people, but it is really ensuring that those people understand their own issues in terms of how they want to progress in their lives and in their careers, but also, and it is making sure that you understand them, but it is also sponsoring them and finding difficult, sort of ways to help them navigate different parts of an organization, or if they want to advance their career. Your mentoring also moves into sponsorship. Yeah, are you actively promoting the individual? So I think allyship is to the group, and maybe mentorship and sponsorship is to the individual to a greater extent.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. And I think that a lot of people get stuck on the mentorship part, but I think that mentorship without sponsorship oftentimes doesn't really lead to change. And so I think that the two together, and the other way that personally I think about allyship versus mentorship and sponsorship is that allyship doesn't end when the person or the group of people are not present. I'm an ally 24/7, and even more so when you're not in the room, right? Because that's my job as an ally. So that's kind of how I think about it as well.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I think when you take on the role of a leader, you actually take on the role of being an ally, because that's what is expected. And if you choose to turn that off because somebody's not in the room, that's very disingenuous.
Yes, absolutely. So you gave an amazing definition of EQ, and I love what you said about being more scientific that people think about it, because oftentimes we talk about this as soft skills, right? We talk about empathy as a soft skill, and it's an essential skill in my view. How do you think, how does EQ help shape the future of leadership in your mind?
So I think leadership without EQ isn't leadership. So I think that's the first thing. So it's pretty simple. If it's leadership without Q, it tends to be management. So I think about, or it's skills and, technical skills. So I try to think about what is the relationship between IQ and EQ. So IQ often got you to where you wanted to be before you became a leader. That was really based on what you know. But EQ is about how you do it. So I think that's a big change, and leaders are expected to be able to navigate the world in a more sophisticated, more complex way, because you're not representing yourself, you're representing teams of others. So I think it is essential that it is a fundamental part of how leadership execution or leadership work happens. I think the most important thing is that when we are building leaders over time, so you're starting off in your mid phase of your career, actually getting people to understand that what will get you to leadership and what will make you succeed in leadership is an investment in EQ early on in the career. And I think we underinvest in that. So mid-career, or maybe even just, maybe right from the outset. With my own children, for example, I was teaching them about EQ. They hit sort of, the older ones, 18, 20 years old. And I said, right, okay, you're old enough to understand EQ, because don't think that you can just go through the world understanding transactionally or demonstrating how super smart you are, because nobody will really care. What people will really care about is how you make them feel and those types of emotions that go along with that. So teaching the children right from the early stage, 22, 23, 24 years old, building on probably the basis that you've given them during your parenting. And I would do that with everybody that comes through the door.
200%. And I think that the point that you're making is critical, that you cannot teach and infuse EQ at a leader level, but it has to build, right? It has to be part of the journey. Do you think there's a way that organizations can help prioritize that? Because right now, I don't see it, right? We've been through COVID. We've seen what, for lack of better words, bad management we've had to face, with people really not being able to empathize with talent that had, maybe sick people at home or children at home, or not having, the setup at home that was inducive to productivity. So, and here we are, we've been focusing so much on technology and reskilling and upskilling because of technology, but we are not focusing on this personal growth. So any suggestions as to how we change this, how we help organizations rethink?
So I think there are a couple of things you can do. One is, again, to the point I made earlier, early intervention, there's no question of it. That needs to be done. But I think it actually should be done in layers. So as you are taking on more responsibility and more accountability in an organization, you're proactively trained for that. So part of any organization that actually developing people to become future leaders, you focus on as much on technical training. And a lot of organizations, big organizations, they'll make mandatory training around technology training. There'll be a list of mandatory training that you must go through. And in order for you to continue your employment on the most basic level, you need to be here. One of the things I think we do particularly well at IBM is that when people are growing into early executive into senior executive, there's a constant reinforcement and a constant drive of more sophisticated levels of leadership development. So at first, you've got to understand the basics of networking, team working, communications, But as you get older in your career, or you get more mature in your career, or you take more responsibility in your career, which is probably the better definition for that, you certainly need to be armed with additional layers of development. So it needs to be programmatic, it needs to be structured, it cannot be left to the individual. It's too much of a risk, because how would you necessarily know the requirements of future leadership if you've never done the role? Somebody has to be guiding you and mentoring you through that process. Yeah. So indeed, people will often understand, I need to be more technically capable to do things, but they don't necessarily appreciate the technicality of leadership.
Yeah. Do you think that some of the misconception and kind of hurdles here are around the fact that, first of all, EQ is not required or is not seen as, a critical skill, and second, that there's a softness attached to that, that is, you said at the beginning, is like it's all touchy feeling, but actually it isn't scientific. Do you think that's what the biggest problem is?
I think it is. I think the fact that we describe things in terms of hard skills and soft skills, that in itself is a mistake.
In itself, yeah.
It's technical skills and leadership skills. Phraseology matters, right? So I think we should be absolutely clear on those things. And I think, I think that's certainly one of the areas to look at. That would probably be my answer at this stage.
Personally, I think there's a strong correlation between leaders that have an emotional intelligence and strong drive for EQ to be part of their leadership skills, and creating an inclusive workspace or workplace even. Do you agree? And do you think that the EQ is actually a critical component of creating a diverse, not just workspace, but mindset and culture?
Yeah, I think, again, I actually think that EQ and DEI are just intrinsically connected. Yeah, I mean, if you don't have EQ, you don't get good DEI. I mean, just impossible to believe. My own experience is that I've been driving DEI, and every time I've been driving DEI, and the moment I started to really be conscious around DEI in my career, is the moment that I started to see much better results in the organization. So that's the first thing. People have to be willing to recognize that echo chambers are just really dangerous places. Yeah, same groups of people, same stereotypes, same backgrounds, whatever else. I think that's a problem. I think in terms of the way that the workforce has evolved over the last few years, especially post-COVID and the usual gubbins that comes along with that, the need to be able to communicate with people in remote fashions is very, very complex. In fact, the nuance between human beings is very precise. It is very subtle at the same time. So actually trying to get people to understand some of the simple things around communication, networking, the use of the tools that you don't, and so because you and I can have a fairly good conversation like this, but we still miss a lot when we're remote working, right? So actually understanding how to make up for that in a remote sense is really important. And it's just really simple things like making sure that people understand how to be quiet and listen versus talk over, and those types of things. Really simple stuff. But the other thing is again, just being a little bit more invested in understanding, if we're going to invest in these tools and these remote kinds of frameworks and these kinds of policies, that you also need to support people in their leadership skills of managing those types of remote workforces as well. And that's just a truism or a reality of life going forward.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that I'm curious if you agree with this, that, clearly at the moment, we're all talking about generative AI and how generative AI is going to change our workflows and pretty much everything that we see in life. And with that, even the role as a leader is changing. Some of the things that now we do as human will be done by AI, good or bad, right? Well, that's a whole different episode of tech. But because of that, I think it's going to be even more critical that as a leader, I bring my human side to the discussion and to the leadership, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, if you want to get access to some of the best resources out there, you want to drive DEI, you have to be willing to run policies that actually are able to attract people that want to come and work for you, that have got very different working spaces. I mean, even something as simplistic as the space that I get afforded to in my universe, in my world, yeah, it can be very, very different from the space that of somebody else that's in a team. And it doesn't mean that they're necessarily in a third world market, although that's eminently possible, of course. But it might be that there is somebody with an autistic child, or it might be somebody that's got parents that are completely sick, or whatever it happens to be. So I think leadership is trying to understand what's going on behind the scenes of your team, understanding the difficulties and the challenges and the barriers that they have got to conventional ways of working, and then working across that, but also recognizing that you can be really biased around that, and actually say, oh, you know, this person just doesn't turn up on time, or this person doesn't bother to communicate particularly well because they're always on mute or whatever else. Actually, you've got to understand, well, why is that happening?
Yeah.
And then embrace that, and then find ways to work around that. And there was just to share an anecdote, a number of years ago, this is also part of the personal journey. I worked at the Department for Work and Pensions in the UK, and there are a lot of people that have been employed there that came from very diverse backgrounds, but also varying levels of ability as well. And the small accommodations that the Department for Work and Pensions made to, let's say, accommodate people that had disabilities, for example, was so impressive. I mean, I was staggered. And the first couple of weeks, it became a period adjustment for me, because I hadn't been working with so many people that came with so many different types of disabilities, whether it was some people were very, very short-sighted, some people had physical disabilities and whatever else. And I recognized in myself that there were biases there, because of course you start to look at things and you say, well, okay, this is unusual. What does this mean? Within 2 weeks of being there, I realized that it meant nothing apart from they were spectacularly brilliant, just as the next as anybody else that was in the room. And of course, why should I be thinking any differently? So I think we all have to go through those processes of recognizing I have a bias because I've been informed to that bias for many, many years. But actually, if I'm open to it and I'm willing to see things, you do two things. One is you overcome your own bias. Second thing is you actually open yourself to huge workforce that you weren't necessarily open to before.
And that's critical, right? I think that to me is still the most misunderstood component, if you like, of the diversity story, right? That it's not, yes, it is the right thing to do. But from a business perspective, it's absolutely critical, because you open up yourself to a better set of people within your talent pool. You are also opening up yourself to a broader addressable market, because you're able to empathize with a certain, part of the population that before you didn't. And that is going to make your products better and your go-to-market better and all that comes with it. And there's so many people that are still missing this. And, I don't know what else we can do then.
There's lots of things. There's lots of things you can do, but I think it's whether you choose to make it an intrinsic part of your thinking whenever you're designing something. Recruitment processes, perfect example. Yeah. Why do we bother examining somebody's degrees before we worry about everything? Because we bias immediately to, do they have a degree or not? Okay, if they don't have a degree, therefore they can not be very useful to our organization. Nonsense. In fact, what happened was IBM, got away with, I think it was something like 60% or something like that of the degrees. I think now we're even hiding those types of details. I think firms are doing that. Something as simplistic as that, you drop the barrier to entry and you open up your ability to hire much more concretely. Something as simple as that will change the game in terms of the people that you get access to. And similarly, conventional ways and conventional working. I think it is important that people are together. I'm not going to get away from that. I will never admit to say all social distanced interaction is the only way forward. I actually really believe in the power of serendipity and the discussion around the water cooler and all of that. I think that's great. But I think there are the means of the mechanisms to find ways to be more accommodating, and you can definitely open up your church of options if you choose to do so.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that oftentimes that, water cooler or the kind of being more innovative story becomes an excuse to force people back to then have more control to some extent over these people, right? Especially from a leadership perspective. But your point about being more accommodating and really creating environment, both physically from from an office perspective, and then from a tool set perspective that allows people that have different, life styles or commitments to really fit into the work culture fully.
Yeah.
I think is critical.
Yeah.
I could talk another half an hour. I always say this, but we have about 4 minutes left. And so I'm going to put you on the spot again before I thank you for being here by asking you any tips that, not from an organizational perspective, but from a one-on-one, so to another leader, as to how you grow your EQ.
It's really simple. Feedback, which is really hard, and nobody likes it. You have to admit. Yeah. Okay. So if you don't admit that, because everybody says, "Oh, I love feedback," and then they get it, and then they realize it makes them feel really awkward.
Yeah, only if it's positive.
Yeah, exactly. I love it when my boss tells me I'm doing a great job. That's about it. You have to be willing to receive feedback from all corners of the organization, and you have to be willing to accept and offer up the awkward questions. Yeah. Do you recognize? Do I have biases? Do you see me with biases? And the biases aren't necessarily in the traditional notion of gender or race or whatever. But it can be actually the way I talk to people. So and of course those things massively matter. But we'll assume that also other things matter, which is if I'm in a room full of people, do I always go towards the ones that talk a lot? Or do I go towards the ones that actually are quieter? Am I pulling people forward? So am I really, truly embracing DEI, and do I recognize the differences at every individual level? You can't treat a room as a room. Everybody in the room, in a sense, is individual. So I think if you don't seek feedback, you're lost. You're completely lost. So embrace embrace the squirmy feeling of feedback, which is what always comes with it. And you'll be so much powerful as an individual because you've got the power to change yourself when you get that feedback.
That's amazing. And, one piece of feedback that I will definitely take away, because I still, especially as an analyst, I don't deal very well. I can dish out, constructive criticism, but I don't deal with receiving them always that well. I really appreciate the time, and I would love, as always, for the conversation not to end here at the end of this 30 minutes. So where do people find you out there on the social webs?
Yeah, I mean, LinkedIn is probably the best example of where to grab hold of me. Stephen.rose@ibm.com is also the other way that you can get hold of me. But LinkedIn is probably the best way, and I'd love to discuss and share and disagree and see how we evolve the discussion from here. I think that's a great way of learning as well.
I love that. And yes, I mean, at the end of the day, that's what I created this podcast for, is food for thought and continued discussion. And, we all have opportunities to learn every day. And I think the moment that we stop learning, we might as well pack up and go home, because then what are we here for, right? What's the point? Exactly right. So I appreciate all that I learned from you today. I look forward to more conversation, and I wish you well for all the traveling and everything else that you're doing at the moment. Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you so much.